Hey everybody, it's great to be here and having a conversation about scaling software teams. Wanted to give a quick introduction to myself. My name is Christine Spang. I'm the founder and CTO of a company called Nylas. I've been the CTO there for about 8 years, and just to give you some context about sort of the scales that I've been through, the company started out, obviously it was just me and a co-founder, and then over the past 8 years, I've helped grow that team up into about 210 people-ish today, and about half of that is on the engineering and product and design side. So hope to be able to share some of the stories and lessons that I've learned from that with this conversation with Rebecca.
And hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Parsons. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for a software consulting company called Thoughtworks. I joined in December of 1999, so I'm one of the few people with this kind of gray hair that actually got to party on December 31st, 1999, because I wasn't mission critical on anything yet. We were around 100-ish people at that point. About a month or so ago, we passed 10,000. So I've seen, an incredible amount of growth. Although as a software consulting company, we basically build software for other people, and our teams at various points, some of them are, a half a dozen people, some of them are 400 people, and everything in between. And we're also very globally distributed, and so the context of scaling a team when you're in multiple continents and multiple time zones is also something that we can talk about.
Yeah, so I was super excited to chat with Rebecca because we have a very different experience in terms of like what sorts of teams that we worked with, but at the end of the day, when we started chatting, we actually had a lot in common when it came to our thoughts and opinions on what works and what doesn't. So I think one thing that would be interesting to dive into first is just kind of this theme around communication, where one thing that I always like to say, and something that's like I've learned like deep in my bones over the course of years of building a startup, is that there are kind of like phases and tipping points of growth. In the beginning, you can fit everyone in a room, everyone can sit around, a table, and you just are sort of in sync because you're talking to each other all the time. But as a team grows and scales, you have to sort of become more thoughtful and intentional about how you're sort of structuring the communication, because communication is the first thing that breaks down when you kind of hit those tipping points of scale. So, I think once we kind of got past the sort of, 10-person, can fit in a room and have a conversation stage at Nylas, like we had to think about, what was the cadence for our communication. Like, were we, talking about things synchronously all the time? Do we write? Do we have like a all hands meeting? Like, do we have stand-ups? And those are some things that, I think has to be really intentional about how you change it as you grow. And I know that, Rebecca, you also have a lot of perspective about like larger organizations and sort of, things about how teams are distributed, both geographically. So I'd love to, hear a bit more about that.
Well, I do have a funny story about not thinking properly about scaling. We started a new client in the United Kingdom outside of London, and it was uncharacteristically hot. And we tried to cram everybody for the initial iteration planning meeting into this room. One person fainted from the heat, and so that's when we decided, you need to think about what the purpose of a meeting or a communication is. What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? And then figure out, okay, in my new reality, when I've got a team of 60 people, and that's the biggest conference room, and we don't want people fainting. That wasn't very fun for him. What are we trying to achieve, and how can we achieve that through maybe a cascade mechanism? And so you have to start to think differently about your rituals. All of the rituals, and people think often culture is the rituals, and I believe actually culture is the outcomes of the rituals. And if you start to think about what is this ritual trying to achieve, then I can look at my new normal scale and say, okay, what do I need to do differently? And one of the most important things is, when you can actually look someone in the eye and talk to them, you get a real sense of whether or not they understood you. As soon as you are, scaling globally and you're doing more things through writing or, in our new reality of over video conference, it becomes harder and harder to understand, did my message get across? And so having multiple forms of communication, even though I hate doing them, videos, email messages, chat groups, a live video conference for Q&A. Think about all of the different forums and forms of communication you can use, because otherwise it just doesn't scale.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely one thing that I've noticed as I've grown Nylas is that you have to repeat stuff a lot as a leader.
Yes.
And like, if you say one thing to a group of 50 people, you should expect that most of them aren't going to retain that. And so it's useful to, repeat a message at, the all hands, to send it out in writing, to talk about it, to have like the leaders on teams as the company gets bigger, repeat that message to their teams in smaller settings. And so one of the things my co-founder likes to say, I don't remember where this comes from, is repetition doesn't ruin the prayer, which is a catchy way to remember this. And certainly, like, as an engineer, like, coming into this, I was just like, obviously, like, if I say something once and it makes sense, like, people will get it. And that's absolutely not how people work. And something that I've had to adapt to as the company has grown and grown. One thing that I think is interesting is like, so as my company has grown, we've also become sort of more distributed. And I know, Rebecca, you have a ton of experience with sort of working in a distributed fashion, even way before the pandemic. So it might be interesting to chat about that a bit.
Well, one of the most important things that we found when you start to distribute teams is you need to think about the full stack. So often, when people think distributed teams, it's, I'm going to build a front-end group over here, and I'm going to keep all of my database administrators over here, and the mainframe guys will be there, and it's all done by silos. And any of the project managers we have in Thoughtworks will tell you in an instant that I could not project manage myself out of a paper bag, but even I know that if you have to coordinate amongst 9 teams to get one line of code into production, that is a bad process. And that's what you end up with when you compartmentalize things by skill. Now, the advantage of that organizational structure is efficiency and cost, but the disadvantage is speed to market. In the year 2000, cost mattered a lot. There was a reason Nicholas Carr wrote that book about IT being irrelevant, because we couldn't deliver anything fast enough. Time to market matters now, and so you want to optimize, not for efficiency. Another really important thing that is related to this, everything should be full stack, is you need to develop trust between the teams. So in the before times, when we could do things like travel, we would ensure that there was a constant stream of non-trivial rotations. It couldn't just be a week. You needed at least a couple of weeks, maybe even a month, where you could absorb what was the culture of that remote site. How do they do things? You get to know their names. You get to know them as people. And then they rotate back, and maybe another set rotates in. But maintaining that level of trust and communication is really facilitated when they feel like they're on one team. And one magic tip, if you happen to be aligned by time zones, one of the things we found is just open up a video conference window, and stick it on the desk with the camera pointed across the room, as if everybody's kind of in the same room. And I have actually watched teams, completely unprompted, get up after having agreed to go get coffee, they walk up to the screen, they wave, and they say, "Hey everyone, we're off to get coffee, we'll be back in 20 minutes." Now, that shows that they actually felt they were in the same room. And you wouldn't have one group of people who was working with another group of people in the same room just get up and leave. That's rude. So they actually went up and said, "We'll be back in 20 minutes. We're just going to get coffee." And I think that demonstrates the extent to which something that simple can help a team feel like even though they're thousands of miles away, they're actually still working together. Obviously, that's a bit harder if you're going between the west coast of the US and India when there isn't really much overlap. But if you've got some time zone alignment, I highly recommend it just because of that sense of identity and closeness.
Yeah, for sure. I think remote gets a lot tougher when you don't have that time zone alignment because you essentially have to work asynchronously, which there's definitely companies out there that have made it work, but you have to be sort of hyper dedicated to the written word and develop a really sort of big clarity around reducing round trips of I'm talking to someone in India, I better make sure that whatever I'm trying to communicate gets across the first time. And personally at Nylas, we've decided to sort of make sure that everyone has some sort of overlapping time because I think it is easier. You have to be really disciplined and kind of build that up if you're going to be fully asynchronous. One thing that I have thought has been really interesting while scaling Nylas is that, Rebecca, you mentioned earlier about sort of, everybody is kind of full stack and that sort of collaboration. And one thing that I feel like I've had to learn is how do you then sort of specialize, bring in specialized roles over time when when Nylas was 10 people, like everyone's title was just software engineer, and there was a pile of work, and we would come in and sort of organically just, divide that up and get to work and say, I'm working on, the front end composer thing. I'm going to work on this, back end bug, whatever. It was super easy. But once you have a team of, now we have, almost 100 people in sort of the engineering and product department. We've found that we need to have some specialties. And so I think, kind of where we've ended up is that we have sort of functional groups, but then the people for those groups are sort of embedded almost in a cross-functional team where, we, for example, have a connectivity group that's working on data access, and that's largely a back-end engineering group, but it has a product manager who's working with that team all day, every day. It has an embedded software development engineer and test, which is something that we introduced a bit later when we're we want to double down on quality, but we don't want to kind of do the old school way of, have a software development group, build something and then sort of throw it over the fence to QA to test that. Instead, we have an embedded SDET who also meets up with the other SDETs at the company and has an SDET manager, but is essentially working as a part of that team. Is there anything that you've noticed around that?
Yeah, one of the things, when I started at Thoughtworks, we basically had developers and subject matter experts and 2 project managers, I think. And that was it. So basically everybody was about as generalist as you can get. You also probably wouldn't have liked the UIs that we designed at the time, but nobody really cared about user experience back in the year 2000. They do now. So over time, we've had to introduce a lot of different specializations, and coming into an environment where everybody's identity is tied up in being a generalist, trying to do this specialist thing is hard. The cross-functional team is critical to allow the team to move fast, but also to align them on the incentives. I had a conversation with another CTO at a different product company, and she was really struggling with the fact that their teams just didn't seem to be aligned around the objective for the product. They seemed to be more aligned to their craft, even though she had built cross-functional teams, but the reporting line into the craft was still exerting too much influence over them. And so, we talked about this concept of a first team. Which team do you have the loyalty to? And these cross-functional teams, if they can get behind our shared vision is the objective for the product. My second team might be as a developer or as a product manager or something like that. But my first team is my cross-functional team, and this is what we're trying to deliver and why. And I think that's an important part of getting specialists in. The other thing that I found is you introduce specialties, the bar gets raised for what the essential skills are for the generalists. It's very easy to describe this in terms of something like database administration. We expect our general developers to be able to do basic tasks of a DBA. But there are times when you're debugging a performance problem or something, you need that specialist. And that's true whether it's a user experience designer or a test strategy. Regardless of the role, sometimes you need that person with that heavy specialist skills to solve the problem. But part of the role of that specialist as they come into an organization is to spread around kind of the 101 knowledge to as many people as possible so that you get more of a shared understanding, also an appreciation of what other people do. Because trying to bring in a new specialty in a dominant culture, it's like, well, that's not very important. Well, actually it is. So let's start to get an appreciation of what some of these people are bringing to the table.
Yeah, that's awesome. We have a few minutes left. I think one thing that would be interesting to talk about is sort of creating alignment and how do you measure outcomes. This is another thing that I feel like I've had to learn to sort of plug on top of the just organic get stuff done, and you can kind of go by feel of does it feel like we're shipping quickly? Are things moving fast? Is it frictionless? Whereas in a bigger organization, you have to have structure and you have to have sort of a way to have every team define, what is the business outcome that we want from whatever it is we're trying to work on. Every reason to build software needs to be tied to some outcome that the organization is looking to get out of it. We don't build software just because it's fun to build software. We build it because we're trying to make people more effective or create some outcome in the world or create more revenue, things like that. So it becomes more important to define and do some sort of goal setting process and create that alignment across the org, and then also find a way to measure whether or not we did what we set out to do. So what's your perspective there?
Yeah, and that's a real challenge because unfortunately as technologists we often get very excited about our technology.
Everybody loves the latest
yes.
Programming language and
we're
going to re-platform on Rust or whatever, and that becomes
and integration technology and all of this kind of stuff, and really getting at the heart of what is the business value, and then trying to figure out, okay, how do I demonstrate it? So business value isn't useful as an outcome unless you measure it so you know whether you're achieving it or not, and you'd be amazed at how many things have gone into production with this business case about X number of millions of dollars in cost savings, and no one ever bothers to measure whether or not they actually achieve the outcome. We are, I think, getting better at that. But trying to articulate that business value and then tie it to the things that you as an engineering organization worry about. Are there ways that you can tie that business metric to your number of deployments or your defect rate? How can you relate those things? Because then it makes it easier for the people who are not on the technology team to understand why what you're doing is important.
Yeah, for sure. I think one important point to make is that I think some people get really hung up in sort of having the perfect measurement, and it's more important to do any sort of measurement whatsoever than to have it be exactly perfectly accurate. For example, at Nylas, I already mentioned we're about 100 people. we set OKRs and we track them in a spreadsheet. Every OKR or key result has an owner, and they just are in charge of updating that spreadsheet every week. It might be a manual measurement, it might be automated, who knows. But as long as it gets measured, that's what we really care about. And I think we're out of time, so it's been a great conversation, and I hope you all learned something about it.